Welcome to the dark side of love. They say desire doesn't always knock politely, sometimes doesn't knock at all. It barges in, breathless, bold,
Yes.
and utterly uninvited, like a storm you didn't see forming until the sky cracks. Open and you realize you're already standing in the rain. That's what it felt like the day I realized my husband's nephew. The boy I once tucked into bed after movie nights. The boy whose sandwiches I cut into little triangles. The boy I reminded to wear sunscreen on summer trips was no longer a boy. And worse, he was no longer just a man. He was a temptation. A temptation I never saw coming. And even when I did, I couldn't look away. It began in the greenhouse. That place always felt like a world separate from the rest of the house, heavy, warm, and perfumed with the thick sweetness of flowers. A place where time didn't just slow. It dripped, moist. Air clung to the skin. The sunlight came in fractured beams through the glass, and every sound was softened, as if the walls themselves were listening. I was trimming a phalaenopsis orchid that afternoon, its petals pale as porcelain, its leaves thick and waxy beneath my fingertips. I remember the exact motion, the small snip of the scissors, the faint shake of the stem, and then the air shifted. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't even a shadow. It was something else, a prickle under the skin, the strange knowledge that someone was watching you. Too closely. I turned my head slightly, but before I could speak, his breath, hot and slow, brushed the back of my neck, and then his hand, not rough, not hurried, just deliberate, placed gently at the small of my back. I froze. His name was Ryan. 30 years old now. Tall, solid. Eyes that didn't just look at you. They studied you. They asked questions you didn't want to answer. But in my mind, I still saw him sometimes as the 13-year-old boy Woe used to call me Aunt Rachel, his voice cracking in the middle of sentences. His sneakers untied, his laughter unguarded. That was before I saw what he had become, before I understood what he wanted from me, and before I realized part of me wanted it too. I was 40-5, married to Douglas, Ryan's uncle, for 25 years. Our marriage had been a quiet one for a long time. Not unhappy, not hostile, just silent. We moved through life together like the old gears of a clock, still working, still in sync, but turning without spark, without rush, without anything that felt alive in the last few years. Douglas had found more joy in the small, intricate world of his model train stand and my company. He'd spend hours in the basement, building tiny towns and painted landscapes, while I sat upstairs, looking out of windows, waiting for something I couldn't name. So when Ryan's body brushed against mine in that greenhouse, when the curve of my back fit perfectly against the firm line of him, it wasn't just shocking, it was electric. It was like touching a live wire. After years in the dark, he didn't speak right away. His lips grazed that tender space just beneath my ear, the kind of touch that's both hesitant and deliberate at once. My breath caught. I should have stepped away. I should have said no. But I Dan single quotes too, because deep inside me, buried under years of being ignored, like being the afterthought, something woke up, something hungry. And I let it happen. But here's the truth. It didn't begin in the greenhouse. Not really. It began with silence. Years of it. It began the day I started fading Ginto, the background of my own life. Our daughter Lauren had gone off to college, and the house became hollow. The rooms seemed bigger, somehow colder. Meals were eaten in silence, not out of anger, but out of habit. Douglas and I only spoke in fragments, grocery lists, mortgage reminders, and comments about the weather. We didn't even argue anymore. We'd become polite strangers, living under the same roof, but in different worlds. I'd find myself sitting alone in the dining room sometimes, the same table where we'd once laughed with friends, played games with Lauren, and stayed up late with glasses of wine. Now, one half of the room was cloaked in shadow, the other dim under a broken chandelier Bob Douglas kept forgetting to replace. I used to drink my tea by the front window, watching the road, pretending I was waiting for someone to arrive, even though I knew no one was coming. Sometimes, late at night, I'd slip into the pantry when Douglas was asleep. I don't know why, the air was cool in there, smelling faintly of cinnamon and old flour. I'd scroll through my phone, photos of Lauren as a little girl, pictures of Douglas and me in years. When we still smiled together, those faces didn't feel like mine anymore. Those lives felt borrowed. Then Ryan started coming around more. At first he'd come to check on Douglas, borrow a book, talk about engineering projects. But he stayed longer each time, sometimes even after. Douglas had gone down to his trains and he talked to me, not in passing, not with half his attention. He asked questions about my work, about my favorite films, about the kinds of books I'd stopped mentioning. Becky's, no one else cared. And when I answered, he actually listened. Do you know what it's like? To feel truly listened after years of being background noise. It's dangerous. The first moment that crossed a line wasn't dramatic. It was in Douglas's study. I was reaching for a book on the top shelf when Ryan stepped in behind me without speaking. He reached up, his arm brushing mine, his chest close. Enough to feel. He handed me the book but didn't let go of it right away. His hand lingered on mine, warm, steady, and his eyes. I didn't look away. Something flickered in my chest, something I didn't want to name. I mumbled something about dinner, but we both knew that moment was different the second time. It was an atlas. I'd left it open on the desk. He stood beside me, tracing his finger along mountain ranges, talking about places he wanted to see. But all I could think of was the way his shoulder brushed mine. Heat of his breath near my cheek. He turned his head then. And the way he looked at me, it wasn't like a nephew. It wasn't even like a friend. It was like a man who had made a decision. The third time was the undoing. Douglas had gone to bed early, complaining about his blood pressure. Ryan said he just needed to borrow a book. But hours passed, we talked, until the clock no longer mattered. When I finally walked him toward the door, we stopped in the hallway under the soft, flickering light of an old wall sconce. I turned to say goodbye. But he didn't move. He just looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that made sense. This isn't right, I whispered. Ryan, we can't. I've loved you since I was 17, he said, his voice steady. I'd sit across the dinner table, try not to stare. But I always did. I still do. I felt my knees weaken. It was like something cracked open inside me, something I'd held shut for decades. I walked away that night. I had to, but I didn't sleep. His words played in my mind over and over, and the terrible truth was I didn't want them to stop. A few nights later, I was in the sunroom. The summer air was warm, scented with jasmine drifting in through the open windows. I stood barefoot on the cool tile, looking out into the dark yard, feeling that same ache in my chest had been growing for months. I didn't hear him come in, but I knew Ryan stepped up behind me. This time, he didn't say a word, and I didn't move away. I leaned back just enough for my shoulder to touch his chest. It was like touching fire and finally exhaling. His hands found my waist, not tentative this time. I didn't come tonight to steal a moment, he murmured, low and urgent against my ear. I came because I can't pretend anymore. He turned me toward him, and for the first time, I didn't resist. Our mouths met, and the kiss wasn't soft. It wasn't polite. It was hunger. It was grief. It was years of silence, collapsing into heat and breath. I clung to him like he was the only thing keeping me from disappearing completely. It wasn't just passion. It was desperation. It was escape. Yes, it was betrayal. But it was also the first time in years that I felt alive. That first kiss should have been the end. It should have been the mistake that burned us both and forced us apart. But it wasn't. Instead, became the match that lit everything else on fire. That night after he left, I sat in the dark for hours, the taste of him still on my lips, the weight of his hand still pressing into my skin, the sound of his voice low, urgent, echoing in my ears. When Douglas finally came upstairs from his trains, he found me still sitting in the sunroom. He didn't ask why I was awake. He didn't even seem to notice. And maybe that was the worst part. Because even if he had looked at me then, he wouldn't have seen the change. He wouldn't have known that something had already shifted, something I couldn't put back. The next time I saw Ryan was 3 days later. He came by in the afternoon, claiming he was returning a book. Douglas wasn't home. I told myself to keep the door closed, to stay in the kitchen, to talk about neutral things. But when he stepped inside, that same heavy air I'd felt in the greenhouse wafted itself around us again. We didn't touch at first. We didn't even move closer. We just stood there, watching each other like we were standing at the edge of something both knew we'd jump into. It wasn't planned the way it happened next. It never is. I was at the counter, pouring water into a glass, my hand trembling just slightly, and then his hand was on mine, steady, certain. And this time, there was no pause. He pulled me toward him, his mouth claiming mine with a kind of hunger thought. This doesn't ask for permission. We didn't make it to the couch. We didn't even speak. The glass of water sat, forgotten on the counter. We stumbled into each other like people who'd been holding their breath for years. Afterward, sat on the edge of the couch, my heart pounding so hard he could feel it in my fingertips. Ryan stood there watching me, his chest rising and falling fast. "This isn't going to stop, is it?" he whispered. He didn't smile. He didn't try to charm me. He just shook his head. "No," he said quietly, "it's not." And he was right. Because after that day, we found reasons, excuses to see each other. Sometimes it was when Douglas was at work. Sometimes it was when he was out with his train hobby group. Ryan would text me one word, "Here," and I'd find myself walking to the door before I'd even thought it through. We never talked about what we were doing. We never talked about the risk. We just fell. The danger made it intoxicating. Once he came over while Douglas was in the basement. We stayed in the kitchen, our voices low, his hand brushing mine every time I passed him something to anyone else. It would have looked harmless, but every accidental touch felt like a spark threatening to set the whole house ablaze. But it wasn't just the physical part that hooked me. It was everything else. The way he looked at me like I was still a woman worth wanting. The way he asked questions no one else bothered to ask anymore. The way he remembered things I'd said weeks before, as if every word I spoke mattered. It made me feel seen. And when you've been invisible for years, being seen feels a lot like falling in love. But the guilt was always there. It came at night, when Douglas's slow breathing filled the room beside me. It came in the mornings when I poured his coffee and he thanked me absently. I'd look at him, the man I'd built a life with, the man I'd promised myself to, and wonder when I'd stopped loving him. Or worse, if I'd stopped at all. There were moments when I told myself I'd end it. One afternoon, I even texted Ryan, "We can't do this anymore." He didn't reply. Hours passed. My hands shook the whole time I made dinner. My mind a storm of relief and regret. Then, at 9:17 p.m., there was a knock at the back door. When I opened it, he was standing there, rain dripping from his hair, his eyes fierce. "I'm not leaving you alone," he said, not a question, not a plea, a promise. And I broke again. We started meeting in places outside the house. Quiet spots, the corner of a park in the evenings, an old hiking trail where the trees grew so thick you couldn't see the road. Those moments felt stolen, rushed, and breathless. We'd sit in his car, hands tangled, talking about nothing and everything, knowing the clock was always ticking. But the longer it went on, the more dangerous it became. Douglas began noticing small things. The way I'd check my phone more often, the way I'd take longer trips to the store, the way I'd come back with that faint, almost imperceptible glow on my face. One night, he asked me if I was happy. Just those 4 words. I froze. Yes, I lied. And he didn't push. But something in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. The breaking point came one Evening in late summer, Douglas was supposed to be gone overnight for a hobby trip. Ryan came over, we made dinner together, drank wine in the kitchen, laughed about nothing. But somewhere between the laughter and the quiet, I looked at him and realized this wasn't temporary anymore. I wasn't just having an affair. I was building something and building something. Meant eventually tearing something else down. That night, in the half-light of the kitchen, Ryan reached for my hand. "I don't want to hide forever," he said. "I don't care what happens. I want you." I didn't answer right away because I knew. Wanting me meant destroying everything else. It meant hurting people. I didn't deserve it. It meant crossing a line we could never come back from. And yet, my hand didn't pull away. I wish I could tell you that I made the right choice. That I ended it before it went too far. That I was strong enough to stop. But the truth is, IWASN single quotes. Because sometimes, when you've been starving for so long, you take the food, even if it's poisoned. It's been months now. Douglas still doesn't. No, or maybe. He does, and he's just pretending not to. I live in two worlds. One where I'm the loyal wife. And one where I'm the woman Ryan sees when no one else is looking. And every day. The space between those worlds gets smaller. One day soon, I'll have to choose. But tonight, I'm not choosing tonight. I'm waiting for the knock at the back door.